Hi there, my name is Catherine Lynch, and I'm going to be talking about the United States' involvement in Latin America during the 20th century. Specifically, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting how Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson handled their policies in Latin America. This period marked a moment when the United States decisively shifted from a continental power to a hemispheric power. Although the U.S. had emerged victorious from the Spanish-American War shortly before this, it had not yet fully integrated itself into the great power system. Europe was still the main superpower, and the U.S. was ready to become a new rising power. Between 1900 and 1920, Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson expanded U.S. involvement in Latin America through a combination of things. They used military force, economic leverage, and ideological claims about stability and democracy. What we see in these 2 decades are the consolidation of the U.S. role as the principal arbitrator of the Western Hemisphere affairs. I will go into this a bit more, as you will see. So, this picture shows us Theodore Roosevelt's approach to Latin American policy. So he set the tone for the early 20th century through forcefulness, as you can see with the image of the cannon. His approach was, I'm going to come in with force, and I'm going to be tough. He had reinvented himself as this frontiersman, and he wanted to be the tough guy. But on the flip side, as you can see in the other image, he was also innovative and ambitious. He had some big visions, which we'll later talk about with the Panama Canal. So, as I said before, Roosevelt was an active, assertive presence abroad. His advice to Latin America was that they needed proper policing before Europeans stepped in, and he told Congress that that's what he was going to do in Latin America. So he believed that U.S. greatness depended on an active and assertive presence abroad. He approached it both strategically and politically. He argued that the U.S. needed to step in where European powers might otherwise intervene. And his rhetoric often linked national strength with global responsibilities. He framed American expansion not as a conquest, but as proof that the U.S. had matured into a world power capable of taking on these enormous projects like Latin America. So, a little background on Roosevelt and why he became this assertive, some saw him as a bully later on, was he came from a very wealthy family in New York City. And when he was elected, he was seen as a rich dandy. So he didn't like that image so much, and he decided to go out west and reinvent himself. He became this rugged frontiersman who had brute force and was ready to take on a battle. And this informed how he approached Latin American policy by being forceful and tough. So, this attitude, his new frontiersman attitude, led to taking on the Spanish troops in Cuba. He welcomed this war. As you can see, this was a picture of U.S. troops in Cuba. And through this came his speak softly and carry a big stick, a very famous line of his. So at the turn of the century, the United States was a great power, but not yet a participant in the great power system. As I had said earlier, that was still Europe. So Roosevelt was thinking, what is a way that we can make ourselves stand out? How can we get onto Europe's level and surpass them? And the way that he decided to do this was the creation of the Panama Canal. This former quote shows that Roosevelt believed that the Panama Canal was both a strategic necessity and a symbol of national vigor, which is what he was trying to get to. He wanted to be on that global stage. He wanted to compete with Europe. He wanted to show that we are the United States. We are powerful abroad too, and Latin America is a big place to conquer. So the Panama Canal would have these big implications to showcase the United States superpower. He contrasted decisive executive action with what he viewed as Congress's slow and overly cautious instincts. The canal was meant to unite the Atlantic and Pacific spheres, allow rapid naval movement, and cement U.S. commercial military dominance. The way Roosevelt spoke of this was very bold and could bring a monumental project into being. Many senators joked that because of Roosevelt's bold way of taking this on, he read the Constitution like a pirate would. He said, "No single great material work which remains to be undertaken on this continent is of such consequence to the American people as the building of a canal," and so on and so forth. He was trying to state that presidents before him, his predecessors, would have gotten caught up in the paperwork behind it, whereas he was a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy and just get it done, which again goes back to that pirate diplomacy that he was following. And here he is, just getting to work, building that canal, whether or not it was wanted. And even when Colombia refused to let the U.S. build the canal, Roosevelt famously said that he took Panama instead. He basically encouraged Panama's independence by parking U.S. warships off the coast, making it pretty clear to Colombia that they shouldn't interfere. There was a military presence, and he was going to do this one way or another. The Panama Canal would not have been started if I had not taken hold of it, because if I followed the traditional or conservative method, I should have submitted an Admiral state paper occupying a couple of hundreds of pages, dealing with all of the facts to Congress, and asking Congress consideration of it. Did he do that? No. He got to work and he built that canal. And there he is again, taking over the Caribbean Sea, showing that the U.S. is in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they are proud to be there, and their presence is known. So, Roosevelt's interventions in the Big Stick era. This happened between 1901 and 1909 during his tenure. In Panama, the U.S. backed Panama's independence from Colombia and secured control of the canal zone. Again, as I had stated earlier, that was done pretty much by military force and just sending a message that, hey, if you guys mess with us, we do have these warships here, so you might want to think about that. And then in the Dominican Republic, the U.S. took over customs houses to manage debt repayment under the Roosevelt Corollary. And then in Cuba, the U.S. Marines occupied Cuba after political unrest, ruling until 1909. And as I had stated earlier, Roosevelt was eager to do that and to join the war against the Spanish in Cuba because it was a good way for him to showcase this force and his new frontiersman attitude. In Venezuela, the U.S. intervened in European debt collection crisis and asserted U.S. policing role in the hemisphere in this showcase that the U.S. does have a say in this area now. This is not just Europe's territory. And now we are on to Taft. So, Taft was known for his dollar diplomacy. He had a much shorter administration, and it represents continuity of what Roosevelt was doing. So he continued Roosevelt's approach, encouraging U.S. bankers and corporations through loans and investments backed by military force to extend influence abroad in Latin America. The ultimate goal was to replace European creditors with American banks and expand U.S. commercial interests. An example of this can be seen in Nicaragua. U.S. bankers refinanced national debt, and Marines were sent to protect the regime. In the Honduras, the U.S. pushed loan agreements to control customs revenue. Taft often portrayed U.S. economic involvement as benevolent, helping Latin American countries escape predatory lending. He saw it as a moral thing to do. Despite his moral framing, the policy still operated from a position of inequality. The U.S. decided what counted as stability, and intervention followed. This slide helps illustrate how economic influence and political rhetoric work together to justify this deep American presence, where the U.S. is starting to ingratiate itself into Latin America and, be seen as needed there. And now we are on to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson took on a vastly different approach at the beginning than Taft and Roosevelt. So, Wilson was a Democrat. He campaigned on having more respect towards Latin America, having a different approach that involved respecting Latin Americans, and this is most represented in a speech he gave in Mobile, Alabama during his campaigning. This is a famous quote that he said during that speech, where he said, "The dignity, the courage, the self-possession, the self-respect of the Latin American states, their achievements in the face of all these adverse circumstances, deserve nothing but the admiration and applause of the world. They have had harder bargains driven with them in the matter of loans than any other peoples in the world. Interest has been exacted of them that was not exacted of anybody else, because the risk was said to be greater. I rejoice in nothing so much as in the prospect that they will now be emancipated from these conditions. We ought to be the first to take part in insisting in that emancipation." So Wilson entered the office promising a break from the forceful policies of Roosevelt and Taft. This was called his moral diplomacy. He claimed to promote constitutional governments and self-determination. However, even as he praised the resilience of Latin American states, Wilson retained the belief that the U.S. could and should guide democratic development. This moral language softened the tone of the U.S. policy, but did not eliminate intervention. Here is a picture of the Mexican Revolution. Woodrow Wilson originally supported this. He was not as hostile as his predecessors, as seen in his receptivity of the Mexican Revolution, and he had moral standing where his predecessors were seen more as bullies. He said, "The United States is the friend of constitutional government in Mexico. We shall now never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest." So his vision of democracy was that the world was moving toward democratic governance and the U.S. should support that trend. His administration viewed Latin America politically instability as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat to regional order, but an opportunity to steer nations toward constitutional rule. Yet Wilson's actions often contradicted his ideals, reflecting the tension between moral rhetoric and geopolitical interests. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between Roosevelt and Taft. This comparison highlights continuity beneath apparent differences. Roosevelt justified intervention with a language of order and strength. Wilson used the language of democracy and moral leadership. So those are vastly different approaches. But both expanded American authority in the hemisphere. Roosevelt relied on overt military pressure, while Wilson mixed diplomacy with only selective force. Together, they reinforced the idea that the U.S. had a special responsibility and a special right to shape political outcomes in Latin America. So they did agree that it was the U.S.'s job, as they saw it, to be a presence in Latin America and to help. Well, then, for Wilson came an issue with Haiti. The U.S. occupation of Haiti happened between 1915 and 1922. The occupation of Haiti further exposes the contradictions of Wilson's approach. Wilson claimed the mission would stabilize Haiti and support democratic governance. However, the Marines installed a pro-U.S. president, dissolved the legislature, and controlled the country's finances. Far from creating a functioning democracy, the occupation entrenched authoritarian structures and long-term instability. It is one of the clearest failures of the U.S. nation building in the Caribbean. So instead of having his high moral standing and spreading democracy, what happened in Haiti was a direct contradiction to everything that Wilson had preached. And then ultimately, Wilson ended up occupying Mexico and through the Veracruz occupation. Though Wilson originally welcomed the Mexican Revolution, he ended up occupying the area and using tactics that Roosevelt and Taft had used that he previously judged and campaigned against. Wilson's refusal to recognize Victoriano Huerta, whom he considered a dictator, shaped U.S.-Mexico relations during a turbulent period. In 1914, the U.S. seized the port of Veracruz after a diplomatic incident and remained there for months. Although Wilson insisted he did not seek a territorial expansion, the occupation deepened Mexican mistrust and fed a legacy of resentment toward U.S. intervention. This is a clear example of how moral diplomacy could still result in the use of force, which was what Wilson ultimately did not want. So, in conclusion, Roosevelt was seen as a speak softly, carry a big stick, use your force. Taft was seen as a continuation of Roosevelt's policies. And Wilson intended to be the opposite, a moral leader. However, ultimately, the U.S.'s role in Latin America during the 20th century was one of forceful takeover, and we did not create the best relationships and trust with Latin America during that time. So though Wilson didn't want to be seen as similar to Roosevelt and Taft. In the end, he did follow some of their tactics. Thank you, and I hope you learned a lot about this topic today.